Are you saying that in a culturally pluralistic society such as America, are you saying that the variable in success or lack of success is the culture of the particular group?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I don't ask what is the cause of poverty. Everybody is born poor and ignorant. The question is, what factors allow some groups to get from that position?
You cite 6 groups in 2 categories. You cite Jews, Chinese, and Japanese as overachieving groups. You cite blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans as underachieving groups. Now, what are you describing there? What have you identified there as a variable?
Oh, income, well, the achievement is measured in terms of income and occupation. That is economic achievement. Obviously, there are other kinds of things that make up life. But, and I wouldn't want to stigmatize groups as permanently underachievers. If you look at generation by generation, you find incredible changes. The black population especially. The change in occupations of blacks between the 1920s and the 1950s is just phenomenal. So that what we're watching are people who, for cultural reasons and historical reasons, begin behind a certain level and have not closed the gap. It's like a relay race. You don't say that the runner is a bad runner because he hasn't closed the gap when he started 50 yards behind. If he's 40 yards behind now, we don't call him a failure. We say he's made up 10 yards.
Well, I'm sure you do know the conventional wisdom in America is that every immigrant group to this country, with the exception of blacks, has closed the gap.
That's not really true. It depends upon what time frame you're talking about and how you define the groups. The Chinese who've come here from Hong Kong and other parts of China since the Second World War are in dire poverty in many parts of Chinatowns of New York, of San Francisco, Los Angeles, in many cases far worse off than the average black. So that isn't true that every group has done this. Blacks started much further behind. I don't think people realize how much further behind blacks started and how much progress has been made. There's a distinguished economic historian, Robert Higgs, who has said that for blacks to go from being completely illiterate in the middle of the 19th century to being 1/2 literate and by 1900 is just an amazing achievement in the history of the world, that you very seldom find that kind of change that quickly. So it depends on what you're holding as your standard.
The standard is that blacks haven't caught up with whites.
Whites haven't stood still. Blacks who have education and who have experience have been moving up on whites and in some cases overtaking whites. If you look at blacks who have not finished high school, blacks who come from background of families that are broken and so forth, they are falling further and further behind, not only further behind the population in general, but further behind whites with the same disadvantages.
What do you blame for that? You're not blaming middle-class blacks who are beneficiaries of affirmative action, are you?
I'm blaming the incentives created by affirmative action, because when it comes to the incentives that are created, the businessman is going to try to protect himself whatever way he can, and that means hiring those blacks who are overqualified, who have a long track record and so on. And that's what all the data show, that for example, black couples where the husband and wife are both college educated now make more money than white couples where the husband and wife are both educated. But the black female-headed family has lost real income in absolute terms over the past several years and has fallen further behind white female-headed families. So the very opposite trends are going on at the same time. And you can't argue this because of blackness or racism, because both of them are black people. One group is shooting way ahead, one is falling further and further behind. And a large part of that reason, I believe, and the data seem to suggest, is because the incentives created by affirmative action and similar kinds of programs just make it too dangerous to take a chance. I don't ask what is the cause of poverty. Everybody is born poor and ignorant. The question is, what factors allow some groups to get from that position? Blacks, first of all, started further back and are coming forward. And at this point, there simply has not been the pattern of entrepreneurship in the black population. That's been true of other groups such as the Irish, for example. The Irish are doing quite well today, but they're not doing well in entrepreneurial occupations. They're in the law, they're in the church, they're in this, they're in that. And on the bottom line is they're doing better than the average American, but they're not doing it in those particular fields. Every group succeeds in some particular area. Blacks who win Nobel Prizes don't win them in the same fields that the Chinese win Nobel Prizes in.
You identified human capital in your book, and you say, now you tell me if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, you say the Chinese succeed because they outwork everyone else.
Oh, yes.
Is it that simple?
In a sense, yes. That if you put in enormous amounts of work, you're going to have a tremendous advantage over people who don't. A study was done in San Francisco schools to show Asians, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and how they score in various fields, and mathematics in particular. And there were vast differences, for example, between the Asians and blacks in terms of how many got high math grades. What struck me was that for both the Asians and the Africans, the number of hours that you spent working or doing homework in math was almost identical with the same percentage who got high grades in math. So that whether you're black or Chinese, if you spend an awful lot of time on the math, you're going to be doing better than the person who's not. And although there were great disparities, the disparities were differences in how much time you spent on math homework.
Well, then conversely, Dr. Sowell, are you not saying that groups who do not overachieve are groups who don't work hard enough?
Sometimes, but sometimes the government itself makes it impossible or very difficult for groups to work hard enough. The minimum wage law is one classic example. Occupational licensing laws are another. Insofar as the school system fails, those groups that don't have an independent educational tradition are lost. Whereas if you have that independent tradition, even if you go to a bad school, if the parents can help you, if you get the maximum that you possibly can from the books and so on, you still may achieve quite a lot. So it's a combination. It is the culture, but at the same time, insofar as the society puts barriers, particularly the government, which has tremendous power, and supplies education and other kinds of things, insofar as they do that, they make it tougher for you to do it.
Well, do you suspect that you may be guilty of de-emphasizing the effects of racism in that pattern?
There's always, everything is a possibility. But as I look at the data, I don't find any correlation between the degree of racism and the degree to which groups advance. That is, if you look at the history of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the hostility they have encountered there will compare with any hostility blacks have encountered here. There have been a number of occasions in the history of Southeast Asia where the number of Chinese killed in a few days exceeded all the blacks lynched in the history of the United States. So they are enormously hated.
What about Jews?
The Jews, of course, the same thing has happened with the Jews numerous times. Thousands killed here, thousands killed there. And of course, under the Nazis, millions killed. The groups, incidentally, which have suffered the most violence, and I use that as one index of group hostility or racism, those groups have typically been middleman minorities. The Chinese, the Jews, the Armenians, the Igbos in Nigeria, 30,000 of those were killed in massacres just within our time. And yet I don't find any correlation in the long run between the economics and the political hostility. One of the things that surprised me was how little correlation there was between acculturation and achievement.
Would you define that for us?
But that is taking on the culture of the surrounding society. That the Chinese, for example, in Southeast Asia, in many cases will live for generations there, maintaining their own culture, their own language. The Germans have done this in Russia and various parts of South America, other parts of the world. And yet, when we look at groups like Hispanics, those Hispanics who don't learn English are far behind those Hispanics who do in terms of incomes and occupations. And what I finally got out of all of that was that if you're working for someone else, then you must know the culture of that society. If you're able to set up your own farms, your own businesses, be in independent professions, it doesn't really matter that much. But if you have to go out and work for someone else, then you must know his language, you must know how his culture operates in order for you to operate in it.
What else did you find out about the Hispanic culture?
That it was not like the culture, for example, of the Germans, that in Hispanic countries, various other groups such as Germans in Latin America have disproportionately contributed to the industrialization of these countries. The British have done so also. That in a number of countries of Latin America, the Germans, the British, other groups like that, actually dominate many of the industrial enterprises of those countries. It also argues against the case of what society does. Clearly in a Hispanic society, there is not discrimination against Hispanics. And so therefore you cannot explain why Jews, Germans, and other groups, Japanese in parts of Latin America, have done better than the native Hispanic peoples of those countries.
In terms of education of blacks in the United States, you point out that over 50% of the PhDs awarded to blacks is in education. And you don't seem to think much of a PhD in education.
It's not a question of what I think, it's a question of what the marketplace thinks, and there's not much money in that. So if you're going to compare blacks and whites who have PhDs, you have to realize you're talking about apples and oranges. If you're going to compare blacks and Asians with PhDs, you're really talking about apples and oranges, since the Asian PhDs will be disproportionately in math, science, technology, and fields like that. So that I think that's a rational choice to some extent. Insofar as people have not had the same educational background, they must do what they can do, not what they would like to do. What's encouraging to me is that second-generation blacks in college, that is, blacks whose parents went to college before them, are majoring in mathematical and other such areas to almost exactly the same extent as the general society. So again, as you break these numbers down, there is a sign of progress, but there's very little sign of any kind of miracle taking place.
What do you mean miracle?
That is, there are people who will talk in terms of what the proportion of blacks are who earn so much or are represented in various occupations. You're not going to be an engineer unless you've got an engineering degree. And if blacks' degrees are in education, then we don't expect to find blacks represented in engineering in proportion to blacks in the society.
So that's an example in which our cultural choice determines our income, and our income is partly due to the income gap between blacks and whites. Is that part of it?
Yes, yes. But that's true not only with blacks and whites, it's true right across the board. The difference between Asians and Hispanics, for example, at the PhD level and earlier, is slightly greater than that between blacks and Asians, or certainly greater than that between blacks and whites. So the black-white difference that we're always comparing is not at all unique. The income difference between Japanese Americans and Puerto Ricans is higher than that between blacks and whites. And yet if you explain the black-white difference in terms of the unique history of blacks, you're left out on a limb wondering, well, then why then the Japanese exceed the Puerto Ricans by so much when their history is absolutely different from either of those two groups.
What about the role of politics in the economic future of blacks in this country?
Again, I would draw upon the experience of other countries and other groups. I can't think of a single group anywhere in the world that has risen from poverty to affluence through politics. There are any number of groups that have risen from poverty to affluence through almost every other conceivable means. When I look at the groups that have had spectacular rises, like the Jews or the Chinese, they are almost invariably groups that stayed away from politics. And they usually stayed away until after they became affluent. Some of them could then afford to go into politics. But that was not the mechanism by which they got where they are.
What was the mechanism?
Basically work, skills, saving.
Now, you're saying then that the train of the black community, in terms of voter registration and political power, political empowerment, is on the wrong track.
I think that if what you expect out of that is economic advancement for the mass of black people. Now, if all that you're looking for is some advancement on the part of the leaders, or if what you're looking for is something like what happened in the Civil Rights Revolution, where you needed to get the Southern Jim Crow system broken, that was an enormous achievement through politics, as I point out in the book. So it's not that politics can't do anything. It's a question that politics, like everything else, has some things it can do and some things it can't do. And from what I've seen of groups around the world economically, one of the things it seems not to be able to do is raise groups from poverty to affluence. People have discriminated against other people wherever they've had the power to do it, almost everywhere in the world and almost every period of history. Some groups are kept back by this, and some groups, it seems to make no difference whatever. Insofar, for example, as you have entrepreneurial skills, the fact that people didn't hire Jews in the 19th century didn't stop Jews from hiring each other and setting up and dominating industries such as the garment industry or the beginning of the great Hollywood movie studios and other areas of the economy. It is the skills that are crucial and not the fact that other people are willing or unwilling to hire you.